We're really looking at tuition, trying to determine what the appropriate tuition rate can be, what the issues are for this state, and making sure that the students can attend colleges and universities and really have full understanding of what the factors are that influence tuition on our campuses.
What does Louisiana rank compared to other states in the area of tuition?
Actually, our tuition is very low. We're about 46th in the nation in tuition compared to the other states, and we're actually fairly well supported on the state side. That certainly is changing as we've been trying to become really more of a market-driven higher education entity. I think the guidance there is budgets for the states have declined over the last few years as part of the recession, and we're trying to address that, trying to rethink how we're going to make sure that the students get the higher education services they deserve.
So last year, whenever we were in this session, we had a lot of talk about student tuition and the rise in student tuition over the last 5 years, and the amount of state support versus the amount of tuition support has literally reversed from a 30-70 with 70% coming from the state and 30% coming from tuition, and now it's the opposite 5 years later. So it's become a really big issue in the state for our students, and I personally see it as more and more of a tax on students' dreams in the state. So it definitely needs to be addressed, and I have a lot of hope for this task force, that this task force made up of some great people, almost half of them are students. I think that we're going to be able to get some great ideas and some solutions, very innovative solutions that maybe we can take back to the legislature this year. I'm really excited to see that the leadership in the House of Representatives is very much pushing tuition and higher education as one of the top priorities in the next session next year. So I think that this task force has even greater importance now, since the leadership is saying more and more that we need to look at this and we need to make higher education a priority in the next 2 years.
I appreciate you agreeing to serve on this particular task force. The task force was created pursuant to House Resolution 206 in 2013 by Representative Ortego, who's here with us this morning. It charges the Board of Regents with forming a task force to study tuition-related issues relative to Louisiana's public institutions of higher ed. All of you who are here today have been chosen for a purpose. That purpose is to bring your expertise, your knowledge, your experience, and your good citizenship into play as we discuss the thorny issues of the policies that ought to be in place, modified possibly, about tuition to all of our public post-secondary education institutions. It's very important that we approach these issues with fidelity, true, rational thought. It's challenging because we do have, as a state, limited resources. That's not going to change anytime soon. So tuition is a factor within the equation as it affects the institutions and certainly the young people that go to school and specifically their parents. It's important that we find a balance between maintaining access to higher education and ensuring viability, and then hopefully a stable funding method so that our institutions can have a benchmark that they begin to work from. That's extraordinary, and tuition is going to be a part of that. It's important that we expand access to our students, but also do that without compromising the quality of the education. I'd like to recognize my colleague on the Board of Regents, Mr. Richard Lipsey from Baton Rouge, who represents the board here. I would also like to commend Representative Ortego for his leadership in authoring this particular resolution, and so that we can expand the conversation about tuition. Your commitment, and I charge you with being realistic, come back to the word rational and keep those as a focus, if you will.
Thank you, Representative Ortego, Stephen, for doing this. I think this is really, really important, and I want to thank each and every one of y'all for taking your time to come up here today and to talk about this very, very important and very critical issue for the state of Louisiana. And Stephen's right. When we look at our legacy as legislators, how do we want to leave it for the state of Louisiana? And I think a lot of people don't realize this, but we're in the middle of our 2012-2016 term. We're at the midpoint. And I think it's time for us, to, as legislators, as lawmakers, as policymakers here in the state of Louisiana, to take a step back and let's look at higher ed. Let's look at what's happened to higher ed over the last several years. But most important, there's nothing we can do about the past. But what we can do is let's look about the future. Let's look about the next 2 years. What can we do to change higher ed and the way higher ed works here in the state of Louisiana? And I have made speeches all across the state that have made the point several times that my highest priority over the next 2 years is going to be higher education and help solve the financial challenges that higher ed faces. And I can only do that with help from folks like you, from this committee, from Commissioner Purcell, from the Board of Regents, from legislators, from the university presidents. I think if they all come together and speak with one loud, clear voice, I think we can do anything here in the state of Louisiana that they ask for. But it's got to be allowed and it's got to be a clear voice. Stephen made the point earlier that over the last 5 years that higher ed has been cut significantly throughout the state of Louisiana, all across the board. And his numbers are accurate. 70% of the funding several years ago was state-generated funds, and 30% was generated by the universities themselves. That number's flipped. And it's not only here in the state of Louisiana, it's all across the country. You can look at the state of Colorado. In the next several years, the state of Colorado will get their university, their higher ed will get no state general fund. They will all be dependent upon their own self to generate their own revenues. I think there's got to be some kind of mechanism there that we look at. People say, well, the state's numbers, the state general fund revenue numbers ought to start picking up. Well, that's a fact. I think if you look at it, and if you look at the numbers and the people that I talk to in the fiscal office and other economists, the revenues do seem to be picking up. But it's very, very clear that there are some structural imbalances here in the state of Louisiana that we have to deal with. With the rising costs of Medicaid, with the rising costs of our underfunded pension plans, with the federal government's deficit reductions that will put more pressure on the state of Louisiana and our narrowing tax base, I think we've got some issues. The revenues will grow, but the pressures that will be put on our state budget will not allow us to invest the kind of money that needs to be invested in higher ed. So with that said, I believe it's going to be very important for us, again, to come together and find ways to make it work better for higher ed, to help you generate more revenue for higher ed. And that's one of the reasons that I think that this task force is very, very important. It's very, very critical. We talk about TOPS. TOPS puts a lot of pressure on our state general fund budget. It's grown, I think, from a number originally of about $30 million to over $200 million right now. I made the mistake last year of saying that we needed to cap TOPS. That's a very, very bad word, capping TOPS. I found that out when I went back to Lake Charles and I ran into people at Walmart and at the grocery store and at church. They want to know why you want to do away with TOPS. I'm not asking to do away with TOPS. I think we've got to find a better way to manage TOPS. And I think there are some things that we can do that can tweak TOPS to make TOPS more efficient, but most important, to make it sustainable for the future generations and future years, because TOPS is very, very important for the state of Louisiana. And I think we got to manage TOPS in a better way. But one of the most important things that I hope that comes out of this task force is that we build coalitions for change and we build partnerships for improvements. I think that's going to be very, very important if we're going to move higher ed forward over the next 2 years. Thank you all very much for your time. Thank you for your commitment. This will be an educational for everybody, not just for you that are sitting on this panel, but for all of the legislators for the state of Louisiana. I'm looking forward to seeing the results. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you.
I'm going to give primarily a background information because some of you have been very intimately involved in what the process that's happened over the last 4 to 5 years, and some of you have seen it from what you read in the newspaper or see on TV. So a lot of this morning's presentation will be a primer to some of you and a refresher for others. This is a graphic representation of what both the speaker and Representative Ortego talked about. This shows the change, the shift in funds over the last 5 to 6 years and how higher education has been funded. This is total funding per FTE for the 2-year institutions. As you'll see, as they talked about, the state funds have dropped significantly and self-generated funds have increased. Can y'all all see it on your monitors? And feel free to ask any questions, as we go. So this is a fairly informal, and again, it's a primer to kind of get everybody on the same page. This is, again, the same graphic depiction for 4 institutions that show the shift in funding. You will see that your self-generated funds, this includes your tuition, has increased significantly. Your state fund support has declined significantly. The problem is tuition has not been able to make up for the difference in the reduction of state funds.
Well, in the past, the traditional agreement was really about 70%, 75% was state funds, and the students paid a small amount just to make sure that they had some skin in the game. Now, because of the changes in funding, about 3/4 of it comes from students, and 25 to 30% come from the state. And we've got to really think about how that funding model changes how institutions work, how we offer programs, and how we make sure we offer the programs that are needed for the workforce in this state.
What's your reaction to everything you've heard here so far today?
So far today, it's been mostly going over statistics of where we are and how we've gotten there. So I'm very excited to see in the next couple steps of actually listening to panelists of maybe some suggestions and seeing the questions coming out of the task force.
And why do you feel it's important for the legislature to tackle the recommendations from the task force in next year's session?
I think that hearing from students is extremely important, and that's one of the greatest parts about this task force is we're gonna be hearing from students, but also hearing from professors, hearing from those who are leading the systems, and them coming back to the legislature with recommendation. It's valuable information for us as legislators.
When the recommendations from the task force are finalized, what happens then?
Well, we usually put these in a report. The legislature is submitted that information. We may testify on that, give them our guidance. One of the responsibilities for the Board of Regents is to advise the governor and the legislature on issues for higher education, and this is our way to really look at the information, look into it in detail, and give a very thoughtful guidance on what we think the future should look like.
If people have questions like more information about higher education in Louisiana, what should they do?
Well, certainly just come to the Board of Regents website. It's very interactive. You can look about specific details about your campus. You can certainly email me there. It'll have information links, and certainly have a conversation, because it's really about what's doing best for the state and understanding that there's a solution that's special for Louisiana, and we want to make sure that all our students have access to the American dream.